Hello, gardeners, and welcome to another Monday with your Gardening Week Live. And we've got a great show today. I already planned a lot of information about starting seeds, doing some garden planning, which is the theme for the month of December. I'm going to talk about hydroponics, but looking at the conversations that have already been happening on the stream, I'm also going to be talking about Johnson-Su reactors and greenhouses. And we're just going to be packed with information, in addition to answering a lot of your questions. And then, of course, the GardenerScott philosophy at the end of this 90 minutes. So it's great to see you here today. It is a cold, snowy Colorado day in my garden. And so today, this is my garden that I'm showing in the background. I took this picture yesterday. It was cold all day yesterday, and the garden pretty much looks just like this morning, and it should through the day because there's more snow forecast. So I hope you're enjoying your garden. Maybe it's not as cold and snowy as mine, but either way, it's always nice to be out. And even on a day like yesterday, I was still outside in my garden surveying, planning, and already thinking about what I'll be doing in the spring and the summer. So nice to see everybody checking in and already sharing their temperatures and where they're checking in from. So such a wonderful way to spend a Monday. And I welcome all of you to this stream. And let's go ahead and jump right into it. Let's start talking about greenhouses. And so True Woman of Substance was asking, is an outdoor greenhouse the same as indoors? And I often talk about starting seeds indoors. And so with that question, it's the wondering what temperature it should be maintained at. And this ties in with a question from Doris Miller as to what's the best way to heat a small greenhouse. So first off, I do not think that growing in the greenhouse is the same as growing indoors. And the primary reason is light. Very few people who grow in greenhouses will add supplemental lighting. And so after germination, when the seedlings start popping up, those seedlings should have 10 to 14 hours of sun every day. And during the cold months, like those of us in the northern hemisphere have right now, we're not getting that much light. So even in a heated greenhouse, you might be able to bring the temperature up to household average, but you're not going to have the same lighting. Indoors, you're more likely to set up lights, and the natural heat of your house is enough. So in a greenhouse, to replicate that environment, you will not only have to set up supplemental light, but you'll also have to set up supplemental heating. Most of the time, the heating is done with electricity. Now, you can actually find some great information out there where you could use a compost pile, a hot compost pile that's getting up to 150 degrees plus Celsius, somewhere in the 50 to 60 degrees Celsius range. And if you're composting inside a greenhouse, that's enough heat to heat your greenhouse. Most of us aren't going to take that effort. So electricity becomes the primary way, and definitely be safe if you're going to use electricity to heat a greenhouse, because you don't want shorting or possible fire risk as a result of using poor wiring as you set it up. Also, depending on the size, you're going to have to anticipate a heater that can handle the volume of air. So a very small greenhouse like you were asking about, Doris, you might be able to get by with just some heat lamps like you would use in a barn for your livestock. And I've done that before. If you have a bigger greenhouse, now you're probably going to want a more permanent heat system that is wired directly into a circuit breaker and a sub panel, and that adds a whole extra expense. So I don't think that greenhouses and indoor growing are the same, though you can accomplish much of the same action. You can definitely start seeds. You can definitely grow seedlings in a greenhouse. Depends on the time of year. This time of year, for many of us, you're going to need all that supplemental light and heat. Patrick, thank you so much for starting off the day with a super chat. Say 28 and sunny in beautiful Trinidad, Colorado. First season with cattle panel greenhouse in full experimental mode. That's awesome. And so continuing this on, since we're talking greenhouses, that's how I typically have grown. And when I had the big greenhouse at the Galileo, excuse me, Galileo Garden, we had no supplemental heat and no supplemental light. And so we grew in the greenhouse, even here in Colorado, Trinidad south of me. And we just grew what plants were appropriate based on the amount of light and the fact that an unheated greenhouse will still get pretty cold. Now you can expect the daytime temperatures in a greenhouse to be 20 degrees above the outdoor temperature or the outside temperature. At night, you might be able to maintain that, but typically it's going to drop to maybe 10 or 15 degrees Fahrenheit above the ambient outside temperature. That's still enough to be able to grow a lot of plants. So when I build my greenhouse here in another year or two, for most of the year, it's going to be unheated because I'm going to design it with some passive heat sinks, some heat batteries, where I'll be able to absorb the heat during the day, and then the greenhouse will stay warm at night. And we'll talk much more about that in the future, and you'll see that in a future video at all. So, all right, probably at least a year or two away. But when it comes to greenhouses, it's more than just you have a greenhouse and you start growing plants. You have to think about all of the plant's needs, and you might not be able to supply all of those plant needs in just a basic greenhouse that you throw out without any extra attention to the plants. Okay, thank you, Jay. I appreciate that reminder that I put in the description as well. That's always good. Brooklyn Giraffe, hello from Brooklyn, where it's slushy and rainy, but the work week is getting off to a great start since you get to watch GardenerScott on your lunch break. That's so great. So glad to have you here today. Vintage Motorcycle Repair says, perfect timing, Scott. I'm converting a lean-to on the south side of the house into a greenhouse. And a lean-to greenhouse is a great option. But yes, as you convert into a greenhouse, the south side of a house, south side of a wall is exactly the way you want to go. And as I get closer to doing my gardening in a greenhouse, I'll be talking a lot more about greenhouses on the live stream and in videos, of course. Elena's asking, I can do my cool weather crops outdoors under some cover, but I have to start my warm weather crops indoors as early as February. Okay, sorry, that wasn't a question, a statement, but you're exactly right. And that's how I see the difference between indoors and outdoors. In the dead of winter, you can start plants indoors, and I'm planning on talking a lot more about that here in a little bit. And then you can move them out into a greenhouse as part of the hardening off process, or especially for the cool weather plants, they can handle that. And so I see greenhouses more as an interim method in your gardening, where you'll start indoors, use a greenhouse primarily in the shoulder seasons when it's cold outside, and then we do most of our heavy growing outdoors during the summer months. So you have to figure out what works best for you in that pattern. Right now, I'm bypassing the greenhouse, and I'll be starting seeds indoors, then hardening off directly outdoors before I put the plants into the ground. Okay, let's get to that question that came up from Georgie Porgy. And it was about whether the fungal hyphae sporulate. And so what we're really talking about, and it's a great scientific question, and I want to thank you, Stinky Vision, for jumping in because you were right on. So already we've got some new people involved with questions and answers, and we're talking science. And so the basic question, because Georgie Porgy is interested in creating a Johnson-Su reactor, is when the fungi send out their hyphae, which is basically like the roots of the fungus, and then earthworms are in that environment, if the earthworms are eating the hyphae, will that fungus then fruit and spore? Which might just blow your mind because it's an awesome question, but it really does involve a lot of science. And so the answer from Stinky Vision was basically that there isn't a direct correlation there, and that's exactly right. And so the Johnson-Su bioreactor, coincidentally, I've been doing a lot of research on because I'm planning a video very shortly on it. You may have seen my recent video where I started making leaf mold. Well, that cylinder wrapped in landscape fabric is similar to how you start a Johnson-Su reactor. And I'll cover all of this in a video. And what it does is it basically composts woody material like wood chips and leaves, similar to making leaf mold. But the process is much more involved. It's building a taller cylinder, much more volume, and then you keep it wet. It decomposes and gives you really a great ingredient to add to your soil. Now, whereas the leaf mold is intended more as an amendment to the soil to improve the structure of the soil, the Johnson-Su bioreactor is really intended to break down this organic matter to the point that it's almost like clay particles, almost fully decomposed. And it's more of a biological inoculant for the soil. So very similar processes, slightly different reasons for doing it. But the end result is you take a lot of wood chips or leaves and you decompose them and add them to your soil to improve your soil. Well, in both cases, it's the fungus that is the primary decomposition agent. And so in a Johnson-Su reactor where you've loaded it with wood chips, the fungi just go nuts. They start sending out their hyphae. That starts decomposing all of the organic material. It can reach a pretty high temperature. And so earthworms do not become a primary decomposer until after it started to break down and cools down. During the process of the decomposition, you don't have to worry at all about earthworms or anything else really degrading the fungal hyphae in that bioreactor. In fact, the fungi is just exploding and growing throughout. It shouldn't, or in most cases, I should say, won't be sending up any fruiting bodies. And so fruiting bodies for fungi are basically what we will see as mushrooms. And so in the Johnson-Su bioreactor, there's a top to it. You actually do have more of the landscape fabric on top. You're keeping it moist, and it's going to be decomposed so quickly that you're not going to see a lot of fruiting from that fungi. It's not going to produce spores unless it fruits. And so you shouldn't expect to have any concern about the spororating. It's a hard word to say. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but you really have no concern about the fruiting bodies sending off spores in a bioreactor chamber like that, because it's not really being done for that purpose. The bacteria will also play a role. Once the pile cools down, you'll have the earthworms and the beetles and all of those other organisms move in. But anyway, I've got a video planned on this. I encourage that you look up Johnson-Su SU reactor and start seeing it, because it really is incredible. Off the top of my head, to begin with, I think it might be more expense than is needed, but I'm going to do it exactly the way that Dr. Johnson recommends in his videos. I've seen some of his talks, and it's going to be one of those experiments that I do in my garden this year, and then of course I'll share it with you. So there you have a quick way to start a Monday with some science. And I appreciate that interaction to begin the day because you guys are all amazing. Not only being able to ask questions like that, but also having those of you on that can answer questions like that. And a lot of you that are probably rubbing your heads wondering just what it was I just talked about. So that's what this channel is all about, is pushing the limits, expanding your knowledge past the point that you even thought you wanted to go. So I think that's a great way to start the day. Hey, MH, thank you so much for that super chat. Came to give a thumbs up now. I got to check out in Arizona. I appreciate that. I hope you can come back soon or see the replay soon. That's really good. Yanette is saying, at some point, can you address amending chitin to your soil in the form of crab life? Actually, I had that written down because I saw that comment earlier. So I will probably address that at some point, not necessarily with crab life in particular, but chitin is actually the component that when we're talking about the fungi and the hyphae, I think it's about 30% of the cellular structure of the fungus is made up of chitin. And so that's a whole nother arena. Yes, I will talk about that at some point in the future. And so when we're using any type of fungally dominant soil, chitin is a major component of that. And so look for that at some point in the future. I've got a lot to talk about today, so I won't actually be talking about it today, but it's on my list. Thank you, Jeanette, and I will talk about that hopefully sooner rather than later. Carla, silence in the garden. Good to see you on a Monday. It is pretty, or actually science, I misread that. Silence in the garden. I was going to say, yes, it is pretty quiet out there right now, but science in the garden is amazing. And I'm actually planning another video coming up next year where I'll talk about homeschooling and also using the garden as a way to educate kids, because there is so much science in the garden. Besides all the math and everything else that we can tie into academic studies, I think science is all around us, which is why I'm so focused on soil, because the science of soil in the garden is incredible. And by just understanding a small amount of it, you will definitely be able to grow better plants and have better success. Jawal Prasad, keep it up. Thanks for that contribution, that sticker. I appreciate that. That's why I'm here every Monday, is to keep it up and pass out all this information. Okay, let's see what we have here. Brooklyn Giraffe says, this is what I love most about the live chats. The GardenerScott community is really generous and supportive of each other, and it's great to be part of it during these challenging times. Absolutely. Absolutely. You all are just incredible. Absolutely incredible. Asking intelligent questions, offering intelligent answers, being supportive for those of all of us that don't know enough about what we're doing. Like chitin, for instance, the Johnson-Su bioreactor. These are all science ideas that I've really only started pursuing more knowledge in just the last couple of weeks. So coincidentally, some questions have come up today, so I was able to throw out some quick answers. But that's what's so wonderful about gardening, is as you're on your gardening journey to become a better gardener, keep pushing the limits, keep finding new things, keep learning the stuff that you didn't even know was out there to learn. And I bet you many of you have never even heard of a Johnson-Su bioreactor, but I know many of you have, because when I did the video on the leaf mold, I had a number of you asking if that was a Johnson-Su bioreactor. So it's so great to see just the great expanse of knowledge that covers all of the viewers of the GardenerScott channel. And I do know that all of you are looking to learn more, or else you wouldn't be here. So thanks for your questions. Thanks for your answers. Thanks for all of that. Okay. Vintage Motorcycle Repair is asking, what's the prevailing opinion on citrus peel in compost? I would say prevailing opinion is go ahead and use it. There are some situations, like in a vermicompost pile with worms, you'll see, I think the prevailing wisdom is not to use citrus. But in a regular compost pile, by all means, just about any organic material can be added to a compost pile. And I don't think you should limit yourself by trying to decide what's good and what's bad. If you eat it and it's the scraps of what you eat, you can throw it in your compost pile and it's fine. And so citrus peels, absolutely no issue whatsoever. And, you know, there's some anecdotal evidence that citrus peels help keep some animal pests away, like cats. So if you have animals that are digging in your pile, citrus peel might be one of those little things to help deter some of those pests. But yes, add it to your compost pile. It's all good. Lady Casca is saying, I planted some baby bok choy yesterday. Should be sprouted by Christmas and ready after New Year's. That's awesome. Lady, and you can go on to say microgreens. What's the best medium to use? So let's go ahead and make this shift now because I wanted to talk about hydroponics. Mark Taylor P had suggested that I bring this up. And so when we're talking about microgreens and bok choy, my preferred method at this point is to use a light potting mix. And for me, just because I have it readily available, that tends to be a mix that's primarily peat moss and perlite. A mix that you can water, it stays moist, and you can keep those microgreens and lettuces and bok choys and all those other things you might be growing indoors nice and moist. And so that, and I'm assuming in this case that you're growing indoors. Outdoors, of course, the medium of choice is a nice amended garden soil. But when you're growing indoors, you do have options. And so it gets back to that discussion about lights, because lighting is critical when you're growing indoors. You don't need fancy lights. You don't need to spend a lot of money on lights. Simple LEDs are enough. And you can go back. I'll put a link in the description below after we're done here. But I do have some videos that talk about setting up grow lights for an indoor setting, as far as the lumens and the kelvins. And Tony and I talked a little bit about this on the live stream a few weeks ago. You don't need to spend a lot of money in setting up your lights, but you do need lights. But you have a lot of options when you come to the medium that you're going to be growing your plants in. Most of my indoor growing is to start seeds, then take the seedlings and transplant them outside. And I'll get to more of this in just a minute. I do that in a potting mix so that I can just take that seedling with the roots already developed in the small pot and transplant it out into the garden. And it's ready to go. It's ready to start growing. Another option, if you're growing plants without the intent of transplanting, is hydroponics. And hydroponics is basically just growing your plants in water and maybe some other type of medium, but all of the nutrients are coming through the water based on solutions, fertilizers that you're adding to the water mix. And so when you think about hydroponics, and I haven't done much in the way of hydroponics in the past, though I might be doing more in the future. There's basically, think of it, 3 basic methods that most home gardeners are using when they talk about hydroponics. And so the first system is a wicking system. And so you have some type of reservoir, and this reservoir has the water, and the water holds the nutrients. And then you have a wicking material that will actually wick the water from that reservoir to the roots of your plants. Now, it could be a material like cocoa coir, it could be perlite and vermiculite, it could be clay pellets. There's lots of different media that you can use in a wicking bed when you're growing plants hydroponically. But the key to remember here is you're not growing in soil. You're growing in usually an inorganic material. And the water with the nutrients is what's feeding your plant. You can also have a raft system. This is often used for growing lettuces and similar leafy plants, where you'll actually have your plants growing on some type of floating disc. And I did do this in the greenhouse. We experimented a little bit with this where we grew some salad crops on little floating islands that was in the pond that we had in the greenhouse. Same basic idea, though in hydroponics, the nutrients are coming from what you give the water rather than, like in the case of our pond, we had fish. And so that was more of an aquaponics system, which we'll talk about at a later date. And then you can also have a drip system. And this becomes much more expensive, much more labor intensive, where you have your plants and you have them typically in an inorganic soilless mix. And you feed the plants through a drip system, often on a timer. And all of it's done hydroponically. Those are the basics of what hydroponics is and how you do it. Kind of like I was talking earlier with doing some research and learning more about gardening, there can be many benefits to hydroponics. You can keep a much cleaner grow room operation. You can set it up in a closet. You can have it set up on a timer so it's essentially labor-free. Plants tend to grow faster. And because there's no soil, you're probably less likely to have some of those pests that even I will have in my grow operation in my house. So it is something to explore, something I encourage you to learn more about. You can get started, particularly with a wicking system for very low cost, really not much more than you would spend just to start seeds in a potting soil. But I was asked to talk about it, so I thought I'd go ahead and throw it out at you as something to consider. When I start doing it, of course, you can expect a video. And I'm certainly not an expert on hydroponics. I've done a little bit of it. I've done a little bit of aquaponics. Right now, I'm so busy. I'm just focused on my own potting soils and getting my seeds started for this next season. But once I get caught up and the garden is built, I am fully anticipating that I will move into hydroponics. So look for that. If you are active in hydroponics, go ahead and let us know in the comments if you haven't already. And let us know what your experience is. Do you like growing hydroponically? Have you had problems with it? Share that with us, because I know a number of you, this is another new topic probably, especially for some of you new gardeners, that you haven't even thought about before. So many of you, I have no doubt, have more experience with this than me. So let us know. Let us know what your results are. True Woman of Substance says, thanks for the response. I have no problem. Thank you. I appreciate that super chat. Glad I could help. Carla Garner saying, I use pine needles as yearly mulch. They promote fungal activity and are beneficial for trees. Absolutely. I've already spread a bunch of pine needles and wood chips throughout my garden. I've got a big pile of wood chips that you might see in the background, some of my recent videos that I've been saving to put into the Johnson Sioux bioreactor. But absolutely, spread all that material. One of the things, again, this is one of those things I've been learning a lot more about in recent weeks, is the balance between the fungus and the bacteria in a particular garden bed. And I've touched on this in recent weeks. But you really want a balance. You want about 50% of bacterial action in your soil, and you want about 50% of fungi action in your soil. That's what the plants that we're growing in a vegetable garden prefer. Now, when you're talking about trees and many bushes and shrubs, you actually want a fungally dominant soil. And so what you're doing, Carla, is exactly right. In many areas of our landscape, we don't think about that. We really should have a fungally dominant soil outside our vegetable gardens. And the way you do that is with mulches like wood chips and pine needles and those other woody materials that the fungi are going to work on and live within, and that's really going to help out our soil. Okay, PD says I added crushed leaves, wood chips, straw, and alfalfa pellets in my garden beds. There you go. That's exactly what we should be doing at this time of year. All of that is absolutely great. Groovin' Bird says, thanks, guys. I don't know if you're new to speaking on the live chat, Groovin' Bird, but I recognize you as a new contributor. So thanks for being here. M88 says, saw my first native earthworms yesterday. Awesome. All of my native earthworms are curled up in little balls deep in the soil. So I probably won't see them for at least another 4 months, but that's awesome. Like we were talking about hummingbirds last week. That first sign of life, the first bit of growth that's happening, the native creatures in your garden, I totally agree. That's one of those things that it just makes me happy every time I see it. That's completely awesome. Okay, Stephen Hope says, GardenerScott, Steve in Sacramento. I love Sacramento. I've got family there. I've spent a lot of time in Sacramento. Can I use walnut wood fireplace ash in my compost that will be used in tomato beds? Yes, but I say that with a huge caveat. I have a video where I talk about wood ash in the garden. The biggest issue with wood ash is it can increase soil pH. So in many areas with an acidic soil, it's just common practice for gardeners to add wood ash to their compost and to their soil. And there's nothing wrong with that because they've got acidic soil. The wood ash tends to raise pH, and so everything balances out. In a compost pile, the wood ash tends to be buffered. Once the compost is added to the soil, there really isn't going to be much of an increase in the pH. So for me, when I do add wood ash to my garden, I add it through my compost pile so that I'm really not affecting the pH. The biggest concern when you're adding wood ash to your compost pile is that wood ash, which is where we get the term potash, which is related to potassium, is potentially one of those ingredients we can have too much of. So wood ash will add potassium to your compost pile. A little bit is fine if you know that your soil has a potassium deficiency. But, and this is where it kind of gets a little dangerous, if you've got too much potassium in your soil, it can actually hinder the growth of your plants because the roots will essentially become overloaded with potassium and they won't be able to take up a lot of other nutrients. So before you add a lot of wood ash to your soil or wood ash to your compost, I strongly suggest you get a soil test done. Now, I know my soil is deficient in potassium, so that's why I occasionally add some wood ash to my compost. But if your soil has adequate amounts of potassium, I wouldn't be using wood ash. So there you have it. Okay. Good to see Jay and Heidi involved today, and Laura Full is there. Tony from Simplify Gardening is active. I've been concerned about you, Tony. I hope you have some videos coming out soon. I haven't seen anything recently. So Tony has been on this live chat before. If you haven't checked out the Simplify Gardening channel, I suggest you go check out Tony O'Neill. Lots of great information. And so let's see. Oh, you're talking to Jay Dixon about different things and getting out of the bath. So that's great. Good to see you here. Yeah, and so Tony, you might have missed it. The backdrop is actually my garden. So the backdrop today is, I think yesterday our high was somewhere around freezing. It was a cold day all the way around. But I took this picture yesterday in the garden. Today we are supposed to get up, I think, close to 40 degrees. That's about 4.5 degrees Celsius. And a few degrees warmer tomorrow. This is actually normal for this time of year. We've been so above average with our temperatures that I've been able to get a lot done in the garden. But as you can see, not a lot getting done in the garden over the next couple days. So yeah, Tony, I was concerned about that. We'll chat on email or on another app here in a little bit. So I'm so glad to see that you're here today. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about some of what I've started to do. I wanted to talk about this today. It ties in with the theme for the month, which is garden planning. And I've talked about this in recent streams. I'll talk about it again. But as I'm looking to my new season, one of the things I have to think about is when I'm going to put plants in the ground. Now, for me, most of my warm season, warm weather plants are not going to go in the ground until the middle of May, maybe even the beginning of June. And I know that because I know my last frost date. And I've got some videos where I discuss this. I'll talk about it in future videos as well. But you need to know your last frost date if you don't. And it's simple. Just do a search of whatever town you live in or whatever zip code you have, and then add last frost date. So last frost date for 80918 zip code. And you'll get a couple different sites, probably more than a handful, where you can find out what your last frost date is. This becomes very important when you are planning your garden, because the seeds that you'll be starting indoors, and I strongly encourage you to start from seed. It's so much cheaper, and really, I find so much more benefit when you grow your own tomato plants from seed rather than going to someplace, buying their plants, and you don't know what kind of growing conditions they had. So especially if you're an organic gardener, I think it's much better to start from seed. But anyway, knowing your last frost date is critical. So I use May 15th as a target for my last frost date. Tomatoes should be started from seed typically 6 to 8 weeks before your last frost date. And so I typically use the 8-week point. That means if my last frost date is May 15th, then I'm starting my tomato seeds on March 15th. And growing peppers takes longer. So peppers tend to be 8 to 12 weeks before the last frost date. And again, I use the 12, which is 3 months. So when I start my pepper seeds for my garden, I'm starting them in 3 weeks or 3 months early. So basically February 15th, so that I've got March, April, and May for those February starts. Well, this is where it gets so crazy. I mean, it's already the middle of December. So I'm only 2 months away from starting my seeds indoors. And I can almost assure you that my last frost date is after your last frost date. So if you're in a zone 6 or 7 or 8, as I know many of you are, your last frost date might be in March, at the least in April. But if your last frost date is in March and you want to grow peppers in your garden this next year, well, back that up 3 months and start thinking about when you need to start. The time is now. If you start pepper seeds now in December, they'll grow into January and then February. And then if your last frost date is March, they're ready to go into the garden. So this is one of those things where it's so insidious. We want to start from seed. We want to really have that full experience from seed to harvest. But we're thinking holidays. We're thinking winter. We're not thinking garden and garden planning, which is exactly what we should be doing. So you might be wanting to start seeds here within the next month, or at least the next 2 months like I am. It has to start now. You really have to start planning your garden well in advance if you want to start from seed. And that's just the vegetable garden. I also want to grow many herbs and flowers. So if you think about it, when you go to a nursery in spring and you see something like petunias that are all in flower and you buy the little packs of petunias to put in your garden, you can grow all of those annuals from seed well in advance. All of the petunias I had in my garden last year, I grew from seed. But you have to think about the life cycle of the plant. Sure, you can start them 8 to 12 weeks before your last frost date or whenever you're planning to put petunias out, but they're not going to flower for maybe another month or two or more, depending on the plant. So if you want to have early spring flowers in your garden that you've grown from seed, you've got to start it well in advance. So I'm planning this week actually to start growing some of my petunias and some of the other annuals so that they're flowering when I put them in the garden. And I'll do succession starting. So I'll start some of these herbs and flowering plants now, and then I'll start some more in a month, and then I'll start some more a month after that, so that when I put them in my garden, they will flower at different times. I'll have immediate flowering. Probably all my neighbors will assume that I went down to a big box store and bought a bunch of annuals off the rack. But no, I'll be putting flowering plants into my garden because I started them from seed 5 to 6 months before I'm putting them out in the garden. Perennials, same type of thing. You want to get your perennial plant started. Most of us are used to going to the nursery and buying a nice established perennial, again, one that's flowering, and then we put a full-grown plant into our garden. Well, if you think about it, most of these perennial plants have spent their whole life in a pot. You've seen it. You've seen these root-bound perennial plants in pots. Now we put them in our garden. They've already hit that flowering stage, so they've used a great amount of energy to grow, set flower, and now we're putting them in our garden at really almost the worst time to be transplanting because the energy is gone. The energy was used for the flowers and then ultimately seeds. So when we put them in our garden, the plants are weaker than they should be. That may be why if you've tried to grow perennials and you bought flowering plants and put them in the ground, maybe they didn't make it through the winter. And it could be because they just weren't strong enough. I prefer instead to start my perennial flowers from seed, again, much cheaper, much greater variety and options for buying seeds, especially on online sites. Letting them grow. And then in the spring, when the soil can be worked and I can put these perennial plants in the ground, they haven't flowered yet. And so now in spring, they're really starting to develop an expansive root system. Then they put the growth into the plant, and then they'll flower at the appropriate time. It might not even be in that first season. So this last year, I grew echinacea, some purple coneflowers, from seed. Did the exact same thing. Started them way back, I think in January, put them in the ground in late May, early June, and they grew into plants. I did not expect any flowers this year. I was lucky just because we had extra long temperatures or an extra long period of warm temperatures. I did get a few cone flowers to bloom this year, but I wasn't expecting that. I was just focused on establishing those plants in my landscape, giving them the best start that they could get so that next year I'll have the flowers. And it all begins with seeds indoors. And so a lot of these perennial flowers I've been growing, I started from seed more than a year before the flowers were expected. It gets back to being patient as a gardener. If you want to save money, if you want to have your choice in your garden, you might have to do that. But think about it right now. Think about it regardless of where you are. Even if you're in the southern hemisphere, this might be the time of year to start thinking about starting plants from seeds. I have some lavender growing downstairs. I started the lavender in summer for me this last year because I knew it would be a full year growing indoors before the plants were big enough and strong enough for me to put them outside flowering. Now, they've been in my basement now for 6 months and they've actually already started to flower. But when I transplant them out in spring, they're going to be nice, big, robust plants. And by having them in the spring transplanting, I'm giving them a best opportunity for growth, especially in a challenging environment like mine. So I just wanted to get you thinking about it because so many of us are in coast mode. We're winding down from a busy gardening season. Well, sorry, you've already had your holiday. It's time to start thinking about ramping up your gardening operations for the next growing season. So Chelsea Tag is asking, how large of cells do you start your flowers in? So a lot of it depends on the flower. Some flowers don't like to be transplanted, but for the most part, like with the petunias and the pansies and a lot of those plants, even the perennials, I'll start them in a standard cell. You know, one of these trays that has 72 cells, roughly an inch in size from side to side. And then as the plants grow, I'll transplant them into a bigger pot, like a yogurt cup or a 3-inch container. One of the reasons I do this, especially when I'm growing wildflowers and native flowers and perennials, is that the germination rates are almost always much lower than you get used to in a vegetable garden. And so if I used pots to grow all of these flowers and perennials, I would have a whole bunch of pots under a whole bunch of lights, and not all of them would germinate. So I would waste a lot of space in my grow room if I started right off in pots. So I start off in standard growing trays with the individual cells. Now this year I did get some cells that are 36 cells to that standard size, just so I don't have to transplant as often. But we're talking a smaller growing area just to get the germination, just so I'm not wasting space during germination. And then once the seedling starts growing, I usually transplant after the second, maybe the third set of true leaves. Then I'll put it into a bigger pot. It might be the final pot. It depends on how close we are to planting time and how much time I'll be having the plants indoors. But typically I'll transplant to a 3-inch or a 4-inch pot after the seedlings have germinated. And I've got different areas, different lights, different tables for all those different plants. And again, I've got some videos where I show some of that. I've got another video coming up here in a few months where I'll show you some of this as well and doing exactly all this stuff I'm talking about. But think about it right now. This is one of those things that you have to think about. And Tony at Simplified Gardening says too much space. Yeah, it's now if you're doing this as a business, if you're doing it because you want thousands of plants, sure, you probably have the space and you can do all of this in all the pots you want. But even at the Galileo Garden, where I had every year our plant sale, I would grow thousands of plants. I did the same thing. Eventually, for the plant sale, I would have 2,000 plants or more in individual pots. There's no way I could start 2,000 plants in their own individual pot to start. That's just crazy. But instead, you do it over a period of time. You do it in phases. So you start everything in a smaller cell. Then you transplant to a bigger pot and put them in a different area with different lights. And if you've got a greenhouse like I did at Galileo, as the plants get bigger in bigger pots, you're putting them outside in the greenhouse and you're still able to start seeds indoors. So this is all part of experience, learning, trying, figuring out the different phases, starting the seeds, transplanting the seedlings. Yes, there's a lot to it. It's simple. It's basic. You just have to do it. But now's the time to start thinking about doing it. Gardening in the North says, I'm late to the chat. Apologize. No problem. What kind of lights are you all using? Yeah, by all means, share. I know Tony's got some great videos where he talks about lights. I've got videos where I talk about lights. I don't spend a lot of money. I just use some basic LED lights and like I have talked about in the video, and like Tony and I talked about a couple of weeks ago, when you think about the kelvins and the lumens, you don't have to spend a lot of money on lights. But by all means, those of you that are growing under lights, share your experience. What has worked best for you? What do you like using, especially if you've been able to have some success without spending a lot of money? Because I'm a frugal gardener. I don't like to spend any more money than I have to. And starting from seeds is just about the best way you can save money, especially if you're saving your own seed. So another part of garden planning, plan for next year. Plan for December of 2021. I'm telling you, you need to start your seeds right now, especially some of your perennials and native plants. Well, go ahead and this year choose plants that you know will flower and seed so that next year you're using the seed that you've saved because you thought about it now. That's all part of how this whole journey transpires. Is I'm regularly thinking a year or two in advance about seeds. What can I plant right now in my grow room so that 2 years from now I'll have seeds? Because there's a lot of flowers out there that are biennial. You're not going to get the flowers until that second year. So like Black-Eyed Susan, for instance. I'm going to start Black-Eyed Susan this year. Again, not expecting any flowers at all in the 2021 growing season, so that in 2022, I'll have Black-Eyed Susan seeds that I can then continue to sow and spread to other areas of my garden. So when I say garden planning, I'm talking some serious garden planning, not just beyond what are you going to do this week and next week, but what are you going to do next year and the year after? And you can plan all of that well in advance. Just write a date on a calendar, and when it pops up, that's when you start doing some of these activities. So Laurel says, the warmer the seedling is, the more light it needs to keep from getting leggy. Good advice. Light is so critical. And one of the things you'll see in my videos, Tony's videos, a lot of other good gardening videos, when we're talking about lights in a grow operation, you need light. The plant needs light. And we're talking, you might have the light 2 or 3 inches above the plant so that it gets enough light, because it's got the warmth of the grow operation. And Laurel, you're exactly right. It's warm, you're feeding it, you're watering it, and it wants to grow. But if the light is too far above the plant, it has to reach for it, and it gets really leggy. And now you've got a weak plant that's growing toward the light. Whereas if you've got the light just above the plants don't need to spend all that energy to grow tall. They could put the energy into a nice stalk and root development, and it's a much better way to grow. But again, there's a lot of information out there in some of mine and some of other channels, lots of good stuff. Lorian Green, whoa, 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 GardenerScott, is that a gold logo on your coffee cup? It's actually, so I use a green screen setup to have the background like my background today. And my GardenerScott coffee mug is actually green print. And so as you look at the GardenerScott coffee mug, you might actually be able to essentially see through it to the background behind us. So it might look like it's shiny, it might look like it's gold, but it's actually just the green screen technology that's taking the green print on my mug and showing you the background in its place. But interesting question. Thanks for asking that. Okay, let's see what else we have popping up. Natasha Klein, I like watching a lot of the 5Bers on here. I'm actually in 6A, but I'm just barely in it, on the cusp of 5B. Sometimes I'll even watch the folks in 4 to get ideas for what is hardy and what they're doing. That is an outstanding idea. I'm in 5B. I think with warming, I'll probably be in 6A the next time USDA updates their chart. I've said that before. I try to do a lot of zone 4 plantings. And so for my fruit orchard, as I was looking at apple trees, if given the choice between 2 trees, one that could, or that was suggested hardy to zone 4 and another that was suggested hardy to zone 5, I would choose the tree that was hardy to zone 4, because you have to understand that zones are based on the lowest average historical temperature. And so that's great. And in my case, my average lowest temperature might be minus 15 degrees Celsius. That's about minus 20 or minus 15 Fahrenheit. That's about minus 26 Celsius. But that's on average. That means some years it's much colder than that. In recent years, it's been much warmer than that. But I think that's a great idea. If you're in zone 5B, don't focus just on 5B, because you may be moving into zone 6A as the winters start getting warmer, and you'll be able to adjust your plantings accordingly. But historically, there still will be severe cold in your climate, and you might need to think about zone 4 gardening. So that's a great idea. I do a lot of gardening. I try to look at a lot of my microclimates, because I've got some zone 4 microclimates and I've got some zone 6 microclimates, and I have to account for my plants accordingly. So great idea. Great idea. I'm so glad to hear that you're doing that. I think that is a good suggestion for all of you. Think beyond your current zone, and that can really expand your gardening world. Thomas Adams, thank you for that super chat. Good morning to you as well. It's good to see you here. I thank you so much for that contribution. So lots of good stuff today. I hope you're benefiting. If you are benefiting from this, by all means, give a thumbs up and tell others about this live stream. It's so awesome. We've got about 250 people on right now from all over the world. And I know not all of you are asking questions or answering questions. I tend to be like that too, a little behind the scenes viewer when I watch live streams, but it's great to have you here. Even if you're not asking a question, even if you're not answering a question, I know you're sucking in all of this information, and it's a lot of good stuff. I see so much good information passing back and forth. Cheryl Fraser's asking a good question. I have seeds left over from this summer. Can I use them this coming season? Absolutely. And in fact, I think the video I've got programmed to come out right after Christmas, I'll be talking about this, where too often we think we have to get new seeds every single year, and that is not the case at all. Just about every seed you have will last for years, and I mean many years. Now, the thing you need to be concerned about, and you don't even have to be overly concerned, is that over time, some of your seeds will die. Seeds are alive. If you didn't know that, they're actually alive. They're dormant. They're just waiting to grow. But over time, if they're in a situation where they're too dry, or maybe they get too hot or too cold or too wet, or fungus or mold sets in or whatever, but over time, some of those seeds will die. What that means is the viability of that seed packet overall decreases. And that's one reason why you see so many sources that will say seeds will only last a few years. Like, for instance, carrot seeds. The recommendation for carrot seeds is that they will only last 3 years. Well, what that really means is that if you have a package of carrot seeds, and a brand new package should give you 90 to 95% germination at least. After 3 years, that germination rate is going to drop to the point that overall, it's nowhere near 90%. But after 3 years with carrot seeds, even if you have 60% germination rate, you're still having half of your seeds that will germinate and grow. Other plants like tomatoes, you might see tomatoes listed at a 5 or 6 year lifespan. But I've got tomato seeds that I've started after 10 years of being in storage. I didn't have 100% germination rate, but I did have some germination. So don't think you have to start fresh with seeds every single year. Keep the seeds you have and grow from them. Another good reason to start early indoors, because if you want to grow a lot of plants, let's say you have a tomato plant that you want to grow Cherokee Purple, and you want to grow 12 Cherokee Purple plants, and your seeds are 5 years old. Well, if you put 12 seeds into pots, you might not get 12 seedlings. You might only get 8 or 10 seedlings. But if you need 12, now you've got time to go ahead and put some more seeds in the ground, anticipating a 60 or 80% germination rate. Go for it. You got nothing to lose. If you've got old seed, go ahead and try germinating it. And I did a video last year about this time where I actually tested some germination of old seeds. I had some pepper seeds in the video. After 3 weeks in a wet paper towel, they hadn't germinated yet. So in the video, I said, looks like the germination rate is so low that these seeds aren't going to germinate and maybe they're dead. Well, after I released the video, after about 3 weeks from start, a week later, those pepper seeds started germinating. It took 4 weeks for that old pepper seed to germinate, but I got about a 90% success rate. And I think those seeds were 7 years old. So you got nothing to lose. Go ahead and start. It may take longer. You might not have as much success, but yes, by all means, seeds from this year and last year, you can grow for next season. Okay, let's see. James Goodwin's asking, what's the best way to find out your plant zone? And so a couple different ways. So in my videos, I have some videos where I talk about first frost date and last frost date. In those videos, I actually have links to a couple different sites. But without those links, just get online and do a search for your hardiness zone. So let's say you live in Denver, you would say hardiness zone for Denver. And it's that simple. It'll probably pop right up and let you know that Denver is probably 6A. That's a guess. But that's the easiest way to do it. It's just a quick search. You can also search by your zip code because some cities might be right on the border between hardiness zones. And this holds true all over the world. If you're in the UK, if you're in Australia, they've got hardiness zones as well. And you can do the same thing. You can just do a quick search for hardiness zone based on your town, and you should see immediate results. If not, then do a slightly different search for a zip code or a bigger town that might be near you, but you should be able to find it pretty quick. Cover crop, I can germinate right now, 9B, borderline 10A climate, trying to improve my clay soil. I got a desert climate, very similar to Phoenix. For clay soil, I would suggest something that has a deep root system. Now, what I'm growing this year is winter rye. And one of the biggest reasons for growing winter rye is because it has a root system that helps break up soil. And then you use the green material to improve the soil after the plant has grown. So I'm a big fan of winter rye. Hairy vetch is also one of my favorites. And you should be able to do both of those right now in your zone without any issue whatsoever. So those are a couple of my favorites. I know the Mrs. Marvel is in your area. I'm not sure if she's doing cover crops right now, but if you are in one of those hardiness zones that we're talking about, go ahead and share information if you're doing cover crops, if you happen to be like in a zone 8 or a zone 9. There's so much stuff out there. Clover is another really good one that you might want to consider growing. You should be able to have clover growing maybe even year round. So that's another good cover crop that has a lot of great benefits to the soil. Carpe Diem Jonah is saying, GardenerScott, if seeds are at 3 or 5 years old and some still germinate, then are those seeds and plants likelier to be hardier plants since those seeds have survived the longest? That's a good thought, but no, not really. The seed is stronger, and so it might be that the shell was thicker. It might be it had a slightly higher moisture content within the seed, but the genetics haven't changed. And so it's the genetics within the seed that will determine the plant that results. And then once you put it in the soil and you have the nutrients and the sun and the water and your care, that's what really determines how strong the plant is. So you can take a strong seed and put it in terrible soil and it's going to be terrible. You can take a weak seed and put it in great soil and it's going to do great. So it's an entire evolution from how strong the seed is to how good your soil is to how good your gardening practices are. But I will say, if you have seed, old seed that you grow and grow that into a plant from which you can save seed, then I'm going to go out on a limb here and say the seed itself may be stronger than other seeds. So when you're buying seed from a big seed company, the seed within that package is probably coming from many different plants, all the same cultivar, but different plants. If you grow from seed, especially an old seed where it might be the only one that germinates, you grow that plant, you save that seed, it's very possible, maybe even likely, that there's a slight genetic difference that that plant is producing stronger seed. The plant shouldn't be much different, but the seed might be a little bit stronger. So if you're a seed saver, consider that as an option. Save the seed from the plants that do best, and that begins with how well they started at germination. True woman of substance. Thank you for that contribution. Lesson brand 1550 looms, 65 Kelvin, cost $20 at Money Tree. Outdoor plants I'll have inside since mid-fall. Under 2 bulbs have new growth. That's good. I tend to go a little bit higher on the lumens. The Kelvins are great. Above 4,000 Kelvins is good, and 6,500 is awesome. Low wattage. The lumens might be a little bit on the low side, so this is one of those instances where you want to have your lights close to the plants. So just an inch or two above your plants when you're dealing with a lower lumens. But the rest is great, and that's awesome. $20 to start getting some lights set up and get your plants growing. Good for you. Good for you. Just make sure that they're close to the plants and they'll be fine. Lar, thank you for that contribution as well. What do you suggest as the best method for cold stratification? Good question. So cold stratification is needed for mini seeds. Often native plants that you have in your landscape, if you're living in a zone like a 4 or 5 or 6, where we have winter with cold. And so these native plants, perennials typically, have in their normal growing pattern, they'll have a plant, they'll flower, they'll set seed, that seed will fall on the ground, and then it'll sit through the winter. Pops up in the spring, and it all starts over again. Well, what is so, I won't say bizarre, unique in a lot of these plants is that seed requires those cold conditions to germinate. So I've done this before where I bought native plant seed, tried to grow it, it did not grow because it required cold stratification. So right now in my refrigerator, I have seeds for the purpose of cold stratification. So it works very well with me, and I've had really good germination rates. So the best and easiest method is a refrigerator. Some seeds want a dry environment. Some seeds prefer a moist environment. You have to check specifically with the seed, and often the seed package or the seed catalog will tell you. But for the moist stratification, you just take a paper towel, you moisten it, you put the seeds on that paper towel inside a little sandwich bag, put it in the refrigerator for usually a month, maybe 6 weeks to 2 months, and that accomplishes the cold stratification. The seeds I have in my refrigerator right now don't require the moist environment, so I just have seeds in my refrigerator. You really don't need a freezer, and I've talked about this in recent weeks at the live stream here, because my biggest concern is if you have a frost-free freezer, that cycling within the freezer of warming up to get rid of the frost and then cooling down, that might damage some of that seed. But a refrigerator, it's all you need. That's simple enough. Hey, Tony, thank you so much for that contribution. Thumbs up in your photo. You're just such an awesome guy. I look forward to communicating with you soon. Simplified Gardening channel. You've heard me say this many times. I know a bunch of you saw Tony when he was on the live chat a few weeks back, but great channel. I just have nothing but good to say. And I'll be starting potatoes this year, and I'll be using methods from Tony O'Neill. If there's anybody in the world that knows how to grow potatoes, it's Tony O'Neill from Simplified Gardening. And I'll definitely give him a shout out in my videos. But when you see my potato videos coming up, I'll be using methods that Tony already has on his videos. So great source of information that's out there. Mark Anderson is saying, I'm in zone 6 and cold stratified some huckleberries for my garden, still growing 4 years now. That's awesome. It comes down to the plant, and you gotta do a little bit of research. If you are saving seeds, this is another one of those things that you have to think about. If you are saving seeds from plants in your landscape and you just can't get those seeds to grow because you're putting them in pots inside in the springtime, that could be the problem. If you've got a native perennial flower and you're saving those seeds, it probably needs some cold stratification. Now, if you really want to mimic the environment, you could actually take a little bin, a tub, some container, put the seeds out in your garden. Just bury that container a little bit into your soil, and you'll be giving them the exact same environment that they came from. And that could also improve some of your germination. Something to consider. Seeds are not all the same. Germination is not all the same on these plants. And a video I did a couple months ago where I talked about sowing seeds in fall for native plants, I talk specifically about some of those different types of stratification and how you have to prepare your seed. And it gets kind of crazy when you really expand your world like that. Okay. Michelle's talking to Jay Dixon. I just filled 28 inches of raised bed with basically hugelkultur. I was thinking I'll need a couple inches of soil in order to plant this coming season. Thoughts? And Jay will probably give you an excellent answer to this. But I have a video, and I've got another one planned. If you look behind me, let's see. I think it's, I need to change the camera view so I can do it. So if you look at this whole garden area behind me, these are metal beds that I'm constructing and will be filling in the springtime. I'll be using a hugelkultur fill method for those beds. And because I'm basically filling the beds just before the growing season, I have to make sure I'm putting in soil for the plants to grow. So what I'll be doing is putting a lot of logs, a lot of branches, covering that with some native soil, covering that with some compost, covering that with some amended soil, and covering that with some more compost, and that's what I'll be planting in. And so in the front side of the bed here, where I actually have some winter rye growing right now, this is all going to be a no-dig garden area. And so I'll be adding compost every year, a couple inches of compost, just like Charles Dowding. But to fill it, you do have to have some soil. You do have to have the organic material in that soil if you want to grow in the first year. It takes a long time, maybe even years, when you're using hugelkultur as a primary method for filling the lower part of beds, especially tall beds like these. Those are going to be 20 inches high all the way around, and you'll see how I constructed that. I've been filming the whole process, and I'll have a video coming out in a few months when I finish filling those beds, so you can see how I built it, how I fill it. Actually, it's going to be a few different videos, so all that is to come. Amy Soden, GardenerScott, suggestions on a measurable way to determine a microclimate. I'd like to use my garden journal, but need suggestions on what to measure. Maybe soil temperature, wetness, mulch thickness, or what? Great question, and you're definitely on the right track. Measurable is a good word to use because we can often look at different areas of our garden and recognize it as a microclimate. But understanding just how much of a microclimate it is can be difficult. So I'm in zone 5B. I can look at my wall, my southern facing wall, and assume that it's at least one zone higher because it has reflective heat, it has conductive heat, and I can see that the plant's growing in there like a lot of sun, more sun than in other areas. So much of it is observation. You can look at the plants and you might be able to tell on the plants. If you have a plant that needs more warmth than other areas of your garden, that's observable. You can also plant specific plants. So for instance, lavender. Most lavenders are recommended down to zone 6. I've selected a variety Munstead to grow downstairs that is recommended down to zone 5. But you can do that. You can actually buy some of these plants that might be a zone higher than you, put them in an area you suspect to be a microclimate, and then track that plant and see how it does. Especially if you have that same plant in a different area of your garden, now you can have a comparison for your garden journal. And with a test plant, now that gives you ideas for future plants that you can grow. You can also check the soil temperature. Now, if you saw my video that I did this summer where I measured the soil temperature in different beds, what I found was it didn't matter if it was a raised bed or an in-ground bed or whatever type of bed it was, the soil temperature stayed pretty consistent. So during the growing season, during the heat of summer, you probably won't see much difference in the soil temperature. But in this shoulder season, in the fall and in the spring, take some soil temperature readings and see if that microclimate area is hotter or colder as far as the soil temperature is concerned. That's a way that you can measure it. You can also measure the amount of light. Sure, you can take a light gauge out, a light meter, and see if there's a difference in the amount of light. Probably not much, but I'm talking more about the sun versus shade. So my shed, for instance, I've been observing that over this last year. The way the sun moves across the sky in my garden during the growing season, the area that's to the east of my shed gets shade sooner than any other area of my garden. So as far as the amount of light that area gets during the day, well, it's just about a 2-hour difference during every day. That area gets 2 hours of light less than the rest of the garden. You can also do the same thing at this time of year. I've noticed that the north side of my shed, for instance, never sees sun during this time of year. The sun is so low in the sky and travels across such a short distance that the north side of my shed is always in shade. So those are the kind of things to look for. Different times of year, how does the sun play into it as well? And also, if you're looking at like a low spot that might get extra drainage, you can measure the soil moisture. So get a moisture meter and put it in the soil. No other things being equal, you might find that there's some areas of your garden that stay moist longer, if not all the time, compared to some higher areas that might dry out sooner. So all kinds of things you could look for. Just start thinking about what plants need and how you garden, and you may see some things that you can measure that are obvious and put them in your garden journal. Start keeping track of it and use microclimates to your benefit. So, Nachi G, thank you so much for that contribution. I imagine you're having a cold day too. I'm not sure if you've got some snow forecast up there, but we're supposed to have a little bit. I don't think much accumulation. We'll see what happens. Rob from Leicester. Good day to you. Good day to you, Rob. Thank you for being here. It's always nice to see the people from across the pond watching. I just love so much the whole worldwide venture of gardening that we're all part of. Myra Sharp is saying, second year using mulch from our trees around our property. Between trees, trimming mulch, and compost, it looks like I might not need to buy anything for next year's garden. That's awesome. That's incredible. The video I just did where I talked about planning a low-cost garden, I touch on some of those basic themes. you can plan to have a garden that costs very little money. I'm actually moving toward the point where I want to do a video where I can tell you how to do a zero cost garden. Now, you've got the initial cost of building whatever you're going to build the garden out of. You got the initial cost of tools. Those are always going to be there. But at some point, that's a great goal, is to reach that point where you're reusing everything you can and you're saving seed and you're building your garden to the point that you don't have to pay a lot. And using your own wood chips and your own branches and your old mulches, absolutely great way to do that. So I'm glad to hear that. Glad to see that you're moving in that direction. Jay Dixon is saying, could you tell people about your discount in your store? You are awesome, Jay. You are just absolutely incredible. Not only keeping me on track, but also promoting the GardenerScott channel and all that we're doing here. So for the month of December, and we've still got a couple weeks to go, at the GardenerScott store, and you can see some of the links in the description below. You can also see some of the pictures and the links below all of my videos. You can go to the GardenerScott store, and if you use this code GS2020, it'll give you 15% off through the entire month of December. So thank you, Jay, for pointing that out. It is one of those things, you know, no obligation. Please don't feel like you have to do this. It does help benefit the channel. I was talking about building a Johnson-Su reactor. As you'll see in the video, there's a lot of materials that need to buy, and that's what all of the proceeds that go to the GardenerScott channel help out with, is allowing me to film some videos that I might not otherwise do, like building a Johnson-Su reactor. So thank you so much for pointing that out. If you're interested, by all means, use this code so that you can get some savings on all of that material. So that's one of those nice little things. I'm just trying to give back a little bit. Okay, it's so crazy how we see the time start to fade away. And Rob says, is it free delivery? It is not free delivery. Depending on what you buy, the delivery changes. The more you buy, the less delivery it is, because they can throw it all in one package. And it's getting close to the time that if you want to order by Christmas, you might need to do it today. I know that their delivery times are becoming a little bit crunched. But even if you don't need it now, you can still order in December and have it delivered in January. And I do that all the time as well. Craig Hughes is saying, good evening. Good evening to you. Have you ever used a Hori knife in the garden? And checking in from Wales, one of Tony's neighbors probably. Yes, I have. And I've got a couple videos where I actually discuss a Hori, where I talk about it as a tool. Last year's video where I talk about good gardening gifts. I think the Hori was one of my suggestions in that video as well. And I've used it in a couple of my videos where I'm planting seeds, because the Hori that I use actually have measurements on the blade. And so it's a really nice tool. If you don't know what a Hori is, it's a Japanese gardening knife. It's actually pretty big. It's 7 or 8 inches long in most cases, 2 to 3 inches wide. It typically has a serrated edge and it has a sharp edge. Like I said, the one I have has measurements for depth. So I've used it for a lot of plantings, especially in older areas of the garden where I might encounter roots. Because if I'm trying to plant something, just a seed or a seedling, and I encounter roots, a Hori can cut or chop right through those roots. So it's a really good tool. Most of the time I'm using it as kind of a modified trowel because it has a similar shape, and I'll just plunge it into the soil to grow the seedling or to put seeds in the ground. But yes, I have used a Hori. I don't have a video that's devoted to using the Hori, but you can find some videos in my library where I discuss it. It's one of those tools I think gardeners should have. It's the kind of thing that if you don't have it, you don't know that you need it. Once you have it, you realize you'll probably use it more than you ever expected. So you can look up Hori, check out my video from last year, and you'll get a link to where you can get a Hori. But thanks for asking that question, because it is a good tool. Thanos, good to see you again. How to select the time, early or late, and fruit to pick up seeds from the plant. Do they differ based on variety? And thank you for that contribution. Great question. And I'm planning a video to discuss this when I talk more about seed saving next year. I wanted to do this video this year. I filmed some of the footage, and then my garden was killed by a crazy early frost. But anyway, you want to choose the seeds that you're going to save and the fruit that are the most mature on the plant. And it does vary based on the plant. So for instance, cucumbers. If you harvest a cucumber that is the right size for you to take to your kitchen, chop up and eat, the seeds inside may not be mature enough for you to save and grow cucumber plants the next year. Instead, especially with cucumbers, you want to leave a cucumber on the vine until it grows big and yellow and reaches the point that you're not going to eat it. The fruit needs to fully mature so that the seeds reach the point that they're ready to harvest. Tomatoes are the same way. You can, in most cases, save the seeds from the tomatoes when you harvest them to eat them, because we are eating the tomatoes at just about their ripest point. So those seeds are, in most cases, completely viable. But you need a ripe tomato. If you harvest a green tomato, then you can expect that you're not going to be able to save those seeds and expect them to grow. You need a ripe tomato. And this holds true with all the plants that you're saving. Flowers need to be fully mature flowers to the point that they're setting seed. So let your plant grow as long as possible to get to the flowering point. Let the fruit develop as long as possible to save the seeds. And that's a general guideline for you to know how or when the best time is to save the seed. Longer is better, later is better. I'll often save the seeds from the fruits of that very last fruit on the vine before the frost hits. And it's the fruit that's been there often since the very beginning. So that's the best way to do it. So we're getting to that point where our time is almost over. I want to talk a little bit about some of the philosophy I wanted to cover this week. And I've been watching videos, documentaries, movies, TV shows, and I started noticing a common trend with some of the interviews that I see in some of these shows. And it shows about artists, for instance. So when I'm watching a documentary or an interview with an artist, it often is the case where one artist, usually an artist of renown, knows another artist of renown. And you see this with musicians as well. Musicians know other musicians. And it's probably not very surprising when you look at some of your favorite artists and favorite musicians to see that they hang out together. They're friends. They regularly communicate with each other. They know each other because they probably have very similar mindsets. They do a lot of things the same because they're an artist, or they're a musician, or they're an author, or whatever it happens to be. And as I started looking at these interactions with some of these famous people, I realized, well, gardeners do the same thing. And I really want to encourage you to do that. For many years, I've had different groups of gardener friends. And so imagine that you are a famous musician and you become friends with another musician. And so what do you talk about? Well, chances are you're talking a lot about music and your careers and a lot of the other things associated with that. Well, we gardeners do the same thing. And so when I've found so often when I get together with my gardener friends, it's great for us. Now, it might not be great for the spouses if we're at a party. The gardeners are talking gardening stuff because we can just do that all day long. And it probably comes as no surprise to you that I can talk about gardening all day long. Well, it's so nice to find friends where we can be in a social setting, assuming we can get back to that point where we can be in social settings, but where we can talk gardening and talk all different aspects of gardening, because all of our gardens are different, all of our experiences are different, and we all want to share what we're doing with someone else who understands what we're doing. And so gardening social groups are just such a great way to keep the spirit alive, to keep the enthusiasm high. And I really want you to start thinking about that. As we move into 2021, and maybe we can start getting out a little bit more and we can start interacting more with some social groups, start looking for some of those gardening groups. And there's a lot of them out there that you might not even be aware of. There's some very specialized groups. Now, I belong to a local gardening club, and we get together once a month and talk gardening. There are also other clubs out there. I know in my area there's a Rose Society where the members there all have an interest in roses. There's an Iris Society. All of the members have an interest in irises. There are general gardening clubs all over the world. And so while you have some extra time, and start thinking about where you're going to be headed next year on your gardening journey, maybe do a little bit of research in your town to find out what gardening clubs or groups or chats might be out there, because it is one of those things. The best gardeners I personally know in my area are gardeners that belong to some type of organization, because it's that group, it's that society, it's that club that really gets them the opportunity to ask questions and to answer questions and to be exposed to areas of gardening that they might not otherwise have been exposed to. And it can be hard, especially if you're a brand new gardener. It can be tough to go to a meeting when you're the new person that knows nothing. But at our gardening club, before we stopped meetings back in March, there were brand new people that just saw, oh, there's a garden club, I'm going to go check it out. And I guarantee you they gained so much from just rubbing elbows with other gardeners. And it's so sad that we haven't been able to meet for 9 months, but I know the time is coming again. I just want to throw this idea out to you that it's one of those things that makes the gardening world better. I know you appreciate Mondays. So many of you have said that Mondays are a favorite day because you can be part of the GardenerScott community on this live chat. Well, imagine if you can carry over all of this information, all of this chat, all of these friends that you have discovered on GardenerScott's channel. Imagine you can carry that over into your everyday world. Even if it's just once a month, maybe you can meet some new friends and talk gardening. You get together with your spouse, your partner, and you do the same thing. Hopefully they've got something to talk about, because I know in my case, there would be two groups. There'd be all the gardeners in one room talking gardening, and then there'd be all the significant others in another room talking about whatever they were talking about. And then, of course, we get together and talk about other things. But gardening is just so important to so many of us that you really need someone to talk about it with. And that's what I wanted you to think about today, is how you can find someone else. Mondays are great, and it's great having you here on Mondays, but I encourage that you do try to find someone else or grow your own. My daughter and I talk much more about gardening these days because she's been helping out so much with the GardenerScott channel and all of these live streams. She's the one that does all the work on a weekly basis to get the questions typed up and get all the timestamps all figured out. And she's developing more and more of an interest in gardening just because she's being exposed to it on Mondays in this chat. And so don't be surprised if you find someone in this chat. There are so many of you that live in areas that are near each other. I know right now there's at least 3 of you that are living in Wales, in the UK. Well, wouldn't it be great if the 3 of you started a nice little chat or a garden club, or are already members of a garden club and share the information with someone who doesn't know about it? So I just want you to think about that as we move through the holidays into next year. You don't have to do this alone, and it's so much more fun when you can do it with someone else who appreciates it, understands it, and really wants to talk more about what they're doing so that you can soak up all their information. So there you have it. That's the philosophy for the week. I want to thank you so much. Oh, there I see Kiri Nowak has checked in. I hadn't seen you on the comments earlier, so there you are. You are here today. So that's my daughter who I was just talking about. It's nice to have people with similar interests, and gardening is just one of those similar interests that we can all find commonality with. So I hope you can venture in that direction next year, and that should make next year even that much more enjoyable than this year. So we're at the end of our time. It's so much fun to see you on a Monday. It's so great to have you here. I just really enjoy the time. I want to thank all of those of you who have participated so much. As always, Jay, Heidi, and Laura Full, all the rest who are giving out great information and asking great questions. It just makes a really wonderful week for me. And I'm not headed outside right now to my garden because it's just too cold and snowy. But instead, I'm going to go down and start going through my seeds and pick out the ones that I know need to be started today or this week. And I encourage you to do the same. Well, let's come back together again next Monday. If you haven't seen the whole thing, you can always see this in replay in just a little bit. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.